On a raw, wind-scoured morning in the second week of April, 1854, on the sagging plank dock at Amity Landing on the eastern shore of Seneca Lake, the produce merchant Elam Firth counted 3 silver coins into the open palm of a young widow named Sabra Ransom, who stood beside a hired wagon already stacked to the rails with 40 barrels of his own cider, gone hard and sour and worth nothing at all to a man who made his living selling sweetness by the gallon. The dockhands behind him laughed before the last coin had finished settling into her apron pocket, elbowing one another and pointing at the loaded wagon, and by the time she had turned the team up the lake road toward Ransom Ridge, half of Amity Landing was laughing along with them, well satisfied that the widow had finally been paid, in full and in public, precisely what her judgment was worth. Sabra did not laugh, and she did not flinch either. She closed her hand around the coins, felt their cool, ordinary weight, and dropped them into the little tin box she kept sewn into the lining of her apron pocket, the same unhurried motion she used for every coin that passed through her hands that spring, because a coin handled carelessly was a coin that went missing, and she had exactly none to spare for carelessness. $3 was $3. It would not clear the note at the bank, not by a distance that still made her stomach tighten when she let herself think about it directly, but it was $3 she had not had an hour before, and it had come to her, as she had rather hoped it might, wrapped inside something a great many people in that dockyard were calling worthless. If a story where the numbers refuse to make sense until the very last minute is the kind of story you like, stay through this one with me tonight. Tap the like button before we go on, and leave your city or your country down in the comments, because I do read every one of them, and I like knowing how far a widow's 40 barrels can travel. The lake itself lay flat and pewter-colored that morning, the wind coming down off the water cold enough to bite through a wool shawl, and the dock was busy in the particular way it was always busy on a Tuesday, when the packet boats came through on their way north toward the Erie Main line, and every farmer within 6 miles found some reason to be standing on the planking with a crate, or a churn, or a complaint. A lake sloop was taking on wool at the far end. 2 boys were rolling flour barrels up a gangway. Somewhere behind Firth's warehouse, a smith was already at his forge, the ring of his hammer carrying out over the water, and underneath all of it sat the smell that had drawn Sabra's attention before she had ever seen the barrels themselves. Sharp, sour, unmistakably wrong, the smell of cider that had gone somewhere no cider was meant to go. Amity Landing was not a large place, perhaps 60 houses strung along 2 streets that met the dock in a rough T, but it was the only lake port for 11 miles in either direction, which made it larger in practical terms than its houses alone would suggest. Everything that moved by water through that stretch of the county moved through Firth's warehouse or past it, and everyone who farmed within a half-day's wagon ride knew the shape of his dock the way they knew the shape of their own dooryard, whether they had reason to love the man who ran it or not. Sabra had married into the county rather than been born to it, and there were still mornings, 3 years on, when the town's particular rhythms, market day, meeting day, the Tuesday and Friday packet schedule that governed half the county's errands, struck her as something she was reading off a page rather than living fully inside, though that particular morning was not one of them. That morning she understood the rhythm of the place better than she had understood anything in months, because she had spent the whole cold winter learning exactly what it cost to be a woman whose errands nobody in that rhythm particularly needed to accommodate. Sabra had walked that same lake road into town more mornings than she could count that spring, most of them for far smaller errands than the one she left with that day, and she had learned, over those months, to read the dock the way she read her own ledger, which boats were running late, which farmers were flush and which were not, which of Firth's dockhands could be trusted to weigh a bushel honestly and which wanted watching. It was not a skill Caleb had ever needed to teach her outright. It was simply the kind of attention a woman alone on a hillside farm acquired, whether she meant to or not, because every small misjudgment cost her twice what it would have cost a household with 2 sets of hands to absorb the error. Elam Firth ran the only produce and commission house at Amity Landing, a long, low warehouse of gray board and cedar shingle standing at the foot of the dock where the canal packets and the lake sloops came in to load. And he had run it, by that spring, for 11 years, since his father had handed him the ledgers and the keys and gone to live out his last years in Geneva at the lake's northern end. Firth's business was apples in the fall, wheat and barley through the winter, wool at shearing time, and running underneath all of it like a second current, cider. Sweet cider pressed fresh each October from a dozen orchards around the lake, most of it bound down the Chemung Canal toward the coal towns of Pennsylvania, some of it held back and let go hard for the men who preferred it that way, and a portion every year, if the season ran long or the weather turned strange, that went further than hard, and started quietly, without anyone's permission, to turn. A commission merchant's whole trade rested on that word, turn. Firth bought nothing outright if he could help it. He took goods on consignment, sold them along the canal for a percentage, and paid the farmer or the orchardist what was left, and the entire arrangement depended on nothing sitting in his warehouse long enough to spoil, because spoiled goods were the one thing in that business nobody's commission could rescue. That was what had happened to the 40 barrels sitting on Sabra's wagon. Firth had misjudged the previous autumn's crop by a matter of weeks, held a large lot of cider back past its proper selling window waiting for a canal boat that came late, and by the time the boat arrived, the cider inside those 40 barrels had fermented clean past hard into something with a raw, biting edge that no drinking man in the valley wanted and no shipping agent would carry, because a barrel that had started to turn could sour the whole hold of a boat if it wasn't caught in time, and Firth's own reputation with the freight captains mattered more to him than 40 barrels of ruined stock. He had tried to sell the lot at a loss to a distiller 2 towns over and been refused outright, the distiller taking one taste and pouring the sample straight into the road. He had let it sit through the winter in the coldest corner of his warehouse, hoping the cold would arrest whatever was happening inside those staves. And it had not. If anything, the thaw of March had only sharpened the smell. By April, the barrels were taking up floor space he needed for the spring wool coming in. The smell of them was souring the air around his good stock badly enough that 2 of his regular buyers had commented on it, and he had decided, with the flat, unsentimental arithmetic of a man who moved goods for a living, that it would cost him less to pay someone $3 to haul the whole ruined lot away than it would cost him in wasted floor space and offended customers to keep it through another season. He had posted the offer with Gil at the general store 2 days before, expecting a farmhand or a boy with a strong back and no particular pride to take it. Nobody had come. Hauling 40 barrels of soured cider off another man's dock for $3 was not work. Anybody with better prospects wanted attached to their name. And in a town the size of Amity Landing, everybody's name traveled with whatever work they'd been seen doing. Sabra Ransom had walked down to the landing that Tuesday morning with a list of thread and salt in her coat pocket, and a colder, harder calculation working underneath it. And when she heard 2 of Firth's own dock hands joking about the offer nobody would take, one of them wondering aloud whether Firth ought to just roll the whole lot into the lake and be done with it, she had stopped where she stood, turned around, walked back to Firth's warehouse door before the sensible half of her mind could talk her out of it, and told him she would do it herself, for the $3 and the barrels both. Firth had looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at an arrangement he suspects is somehow going to cost him more than it appears to, running his eyes once over her plain gray dress and the basket on her arm as though trying to place exactly what use a farm widow could possibly have for 40 barrels of ruined cider. And then he had laughed, not unkindly exactly, but with the easy carelessness of a man who did not expect to be proven wrong by anybody standing on his own dock, let alone a widow with a borrowed wagon. "The barrels are yours to keep or burn, Mrs. Ransom," he'd said. "And welcome to them. I'll throw in the $3 just for the pleasure of never smelling that lot again." He had not asked what she wanted with 40 barrels of ruined cider, because it plainly had not occurred to him that the answer mattered, or that there was an answer at all beyond a widow's poor judgment finding a new place to spend itself. She had not told him. She had simply held out her hand, and when the coins landed in it, cool and heavier than $3 had any right to feel, she had turned toward the wagon, already doing sums in her head that had nothing to do with the $3 at all. She had hired Ezra Poole and his dray for the day, 60 cents out of her own pocket before she had earned a single cent of the $3 back, because 40 barrels of cider weighed close to 300 pounds apiece, and there was no version of that morning where one woman and one wagon moved them alone in a single trip. Ezra was 17, broad through the shoulders already in the particular way boys got who'd been doing a grown man's work since 12, and he asked no questions beyond whether she wanted them stacked 2 barrels or 3 to a load, which she appreciated more than she let on, because every question she didn't have to answer that morning was a question she didn't yet have a good answer for. It took the better part of the morning, 4 separate trips up the lake road and the steep last quarter mile onto Ransom Ridge. The barrels rolled and levered and half-carried into the empty hayloft over her barn, while the horse stood patient in the traces and the April wind kept trying to work its way down the back of her collar. By the time the last one thudded into place against the loft's north wall, both her arms ached in a way that had nothing to do with the $3 in her pocket, and everything to do with what she intended to do with the 40 barrels now sitting, sour and unwanted, under her own roof, and Ezra stood in the loft doorway a moment, wrinkling his nose at the smell, before he finally asked the one question he'd been holding all morning. "What are you fixing to do with all this, Mrs. Ransom?" He considered the matter with the frank skepticism of a boy who had hauled enough ruined goods in his short working life to have formed opinions about which ones ever came back from ruin and which ones didn't. "My pa always says once cider's turned, it's turned for good," he offered, not unkindly, cinching the last strap on his empty dray. "Nothing to be done for it but pour it out on the compost and be glad it wasn't worse." "Your pa may be right," Sabra said, and meant it. She had no interest in arguing a boy of 17 into a confidence she was not yet sure she owned herself in full daylight. "We'll know come autumn." Ezra shrugged in the manner of someone who had said his piece and did not much care whether it was heated, took his 60 cents, counted it once out of habit rather than distrust, and drove off down the ridge road no more enlightened than when he'd arrived, which suited her fine for the time being. She had found, over 3 months of widowhood, that the fewer people who understood her plans before they'd proven themselves, the fewer people stood ready to talk her out of them. Only after the last barrel was settled did Sabra remember the thread and salt still folded in her coat pocket, the whole ordinary purpose of her morning's walk to town, and she found the discovery almost funny in a way she did not examine too closely, that a woman could set out to buy 3 cents of thread and come home instead with 40 barrels of another man's failure and the beginnings of a plan she had not yet said aloud to a living soul. She walked back down to Gill's before supper to finish the errand properly, because a household still needed thread and salt, whatever else was happening in its hayloft, and paid for both out of the ordinary egg money without touching a cent of Firth's $3, keeping the 2 accounts as separate in her mind as she kept them in the ledger, the household on one line, and the wager, if that was truly what it was, on another. The laughing had not stopped at the dock. It had simply changed shape, the way gossip in a small lake town always did, traveling faster on foot than the wagon had traveled by road, so that by the time Sabra brought the last load up the hill, half of Amity Landing already had a version of the story, most of them embellishing it a little more with every retelling. Prentice Gill, who kept the general store and had been at the landing that morning buying feed sacks, had watched the whole transaction from the loading platform with his arms folded and his face doing very little to hide what he thought of it. He had known Sabra Ransom for 3 years, since she and her husband Caleb had come up from the south end of the county to take the Ridge farm, and he considered himself, in a mild and not unkind way, one of the people in Amity Landing who worried about her rather than laughed at her, which was its own kind of exhausting to be on the receiving end of, and which he made no particular secret of on his walk back to the store, where he mentioned to his own wife over the noon meal that the widow Ransom seemed determined to try every wrong turn on that hillside before she found the right one. $3 for another man's rubbish, Gil had said to Sabra directly, not unfriendly, as she passed him on her second trip through town with the wagon groaning under its load. I hope you know what you're about, Mrs. Ransom, because I don't, and I've been selling to this valley 11 years. I know what I'm about, Mr. Gil, she'd told him, and kept walking, because there was nothing to be gained by explaining a plan to a man standing in the middle of a public street with an audience of dock hands still close enough to hear, and because if she was honest with herself standing there in the cold April wind, the plan was not yet entirely a plan. It was a memory with a shape to it, and a stubborn conviction that the shape was worth testing against 40 free barrels of exactly the raw material it required. She had learned, in 3 months of being a widow rather than a wife, that a woman who explained herself too early only handed her doubters more places to aim. Sabra Ransom was 27 that spring, and she had been alone on the Ridge farm since the past January, when a fever that started as an ordinary winter cough had taken her husband Caleb inside of 11 days, fast enough that she had barely finished being frightened before she was widowed, and the house had gone quiet in a way no amount of housework ever quite filled back in. Caleb had been a careful, quiet man, the kind who wrote every purchase down in a ledger the same night he made it, who trusted numbers the way other men trusted their own eyesight, and who had courted her 3 years before with nothing more romantic than an offer to help her father, True, up a set of crooked fence posts and a habit of arriving early to every gathering, so he could sit near enough to hear what she actually said, rather than what politeness required her to say. Theirs had not been a loud marriage. It had been the kind built out of small competencies noticed and quietly relied upon, and Sabra had not fully understood how much of her own daily footing had rested on his until the house had gone silent and she'd had to learn, in a single hard winter, which of the farm's 100 small decisions had always secretly been hers to make, and which had always, without either of them remarking on it, been his. She still had, tucked into the same trunk that held her mother's old recipe scraps, a single weathered fence post from that first crooked line Caleb had helped her father true up, which he had insisted on saving and resetting properly rather than replacing outright, on the theory that a post with history in it held truer than a new one, a small superstition she had teased him over at the time and found herself, oddly, unwilling to argue with, now that he was gone. She did not go looking for that trunk often, but she knew where it was, the way she knew where every other fixed point on the farm was, and some nights that knowledge alone was steadying enough to let her sleep. He had left her, along with 11 acres of hillside orchard and hay ground above Amity Landing, a debt he had taken on with the best of intentions 2 years before he died. In the spring of 1852, the two of them had borrowed $81 from the bank at Amity Landing to clear 3 additional acres of orchard ground on the ridge's south slope and to line a proper stone root cellar under the kitchen, replacing the damp dirt hole that had been ruining half their winter stores every year since they'd bought the place. It had seemed, at the time, a reasonable and even a modest debt, the kind 2 young people with a farm and their whole lives ahead of them took on without much anxiety, to be paid down a little every season from apple money and wool money and whatever else the Ridge gave them, and Caleb had entered it in his own ledger in his own careful hand, as though it were already as good as settled. Caleb's death had not erased the debt. It had simply left Sabra to carry the whole of it alone, on a farm that produced, in a good year, perhaps $40 of saleable surplus beyond what she needed to feed herself and keep the place standing. She had paid what she could through that first hard winter, mostly interest, walking down to the bank herself each month with whatever small sum she'd managed to set aside, and the bank's cashier, a narrow, careful man named Dwight Sallow, had called her into his small side office on a bitter afternoon in February to tell her plainly what the arithmetic required of her. He had not been unkind about it. He had laid the note itself flat on the desk between them, turned it so she could read the figures right side up rather than across the counter, and traced the relevant clause with one finger the way a schoolmaster points out a line of Latin a pupil has already half guessed at. "The full remaining balance is $81, Mrs. Ransom," he had said, "due and payable by the last day of September. I am sorry to bring it to you cold like this, but I'd sooner you have the whole of the year to plan around it than have it come as a surprise in August." She had asked evenly whether the bank might extend the note a second time the way it had once already, quietly, in the fall after Caleb died. Not without a co-signer, Sallow had told her, not unkindly, closing the ledger. "Mr. Ransom's note carried his name and yours both, but the bank's directors are cautious about carrying a debt on a single unmarried name a second year running, whatever the circumstances that brought it about. I don't make the rule, Mrs. Ransom. I only read it to you." She had thanked him, folded the paper he handed her, and walked the 3 miles home, turning the word unmarried over in her mind the whole way, understanding for the first time with any real clarity that the bank's caution had nothing to do with her character and everything to do with an arithmetic that simply did not care what kind of woman she was. She had done the arithmetic herself more times than she could count that winter, lying awake doing sums that came out wrong in the same handful of ways, no matter how she rearranged them. 11 acres of orchard hay ground, a widow's own 2 hands, and 5 months to find $81 that did not currently exist anywhere in her life. It was, by any reasonable measure, an impossible number, and Sabra had spent the cold months of February and March turning over every possible way to make it a little less impossible, selling eggs to Gill's store on Saturdays for a few cents a dozen, taking in mending from 3 families down the Ridge Road at a nickel the garment. The Purdy's alone had kept her busy most of one February week, patching a set of 6 winter shirts gone through at the elbow, old man Purdy being harder on a shirt than any 3 younger men combined, and Sabra had sat by the fire each of those evenings with her needle and a candle stub, adding the nickels in her head before she'd even finished the seam, the way a person does arithmetic on a debt that never quite leaves the room. She had sold the last of Caleb's good tools she did not truly need to a neighbor who paid fair and asked no questions besides. None of it, added together, came anywhere close to closing a gap of $81 by the last day of September, and by the time the snow finally gave way to mud in late March, she had begun to understand that whatever closed that gap would have to be something larger than thrift, because thrift alone only slowed how fast a person went under, and she did not intend to go under slowly or otherwise. What she had, instead of a plan that made obvious sense to anyone standing on Firth's dock that April morning, was a memory nearly 20 years old. Her own mother, back in the county where Sabra had grown up 2 days' ride to the east, had kept a squat stone crock in the corner of the spring house that nobody in the family was allowed to disturb, filled with something her mother called, without much further explanation, the vinegar, and topped up every autumn with whatever cider had gone hard past drinking before anyone could use it. Sabra remembered the sharp, clean smell of it drifting out whenever the lid came off, and the particular ceremony her mother made of testing it, dipping one finger and touching it once to her tongue with the seriousness of a woman consulting an oracle. She remembered her mother selling small jugs of it to neighbors every spring for a price that had seemed to a girl of 9 or 10 watching from the spring house doorway like a magic trick, turning a barrel of spoiled cider nobody wanted into coin simply by leaving it alone in the right way for long enough and knowing somehow exactly how long was long enough. She had never made it herself. She had never needed to, with her mother's crock always there to draw from, until a fever took Caleb and left her staring at an $81 debt with nothing in her hands but a hillside, a widow's pension of nothing at all, and, as of that April morning, 40 barrels of exactly the raw material her mother's trick had always required, sitting free for the taking in another man's warehouse, offered to her, of all the ironies the spring had produced yet, as a kindness she was being paid to accept. She stood in the loft that evening after Ezra had gone home with his 60 cents, looking at 40 barrels stacked in uneven rows against the north and east walls, the whole loft filled with a sharp, faintly rotten smell that made her eyes water a little when she climbed the ladder. And she understood, standing there in the last of the daylight coming through the gable window, that she did not actually know how to do the thing she had just spent a full morning's labor and 60 of her own hard cents arranging to attempt. She knew the smell of it, and she knew the coin it had once brought her mother, and she knew, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had run out of better options and did not intend to apologize for it, that there was exactly one person left on the Ridge Road who might know how to close the distance between those two facts before the last day of September arrived. Temperance Ruck lived a mile and a half up the hollow behind Ransom Ridge, in a low gray farmhouse she had occupied alone since her own husband died of a logging accident the better part of 2 decades before. Felled by a beech tree he'd misjudged the lean of on a still January morning, a story Temperance told plainly and without self-pity to anyone who asked, and to almost nobody who didn't. The county's general opinion of her ran, depending on who was asked, somewhere between a harmless old eccentric and a woman who knew things worth knowing and had simply stopped explaining herself to people who wouldn't have believed her anyway. She kept a small flock of hens, a kitchen garden that outproduced most farms 4 times its size, and a reputation, quiet but durable, for being the person a hollow full of practical women went to when something needed doing that none of them had learned from their own mothers, a fever that wouldn't break, a hive that had gone silent, a jar of preserves that had turned cloudy for no reason anyone else could name. Sabra had known her only slightly before that April, a nodding acquaintance at church and the general store, but she had heard more than once, second-hand, and never as gossip exactly, that Temperance Ruck had kept a barrel of her own vinegar going for as long as anyone in the hollow could remember, and sold small jugs of it quietly to whoever asked, without ever once trying to make more of the business than her own 2 hands could manage. Sabra rode up on the second morning after the barrels arrived, before the day's other work could swallow her nerve, and found Temperance in her dooryard, splitting kindling with the economical, unhurried motion of a woman who had been doing exactly that chore at exactly that hour for 40 years. Temperance heard her out, the 40 barrels, the $3, the 81 owed at the bank, the memory of her own mother's crock, without interrupting once, setting down 1 stick of kindling at a time as though the story itself required careful stacking, and when Sabra finished, the old woman set down her hatchet entirely, looked at her for a long moment with an expression Sabra could not entirely read, something between appraisal and the faint private amusement of a woman recognizing a kindred stubbornness, and said only, "Well, come and see mine then, and we'll talk about whether yours has any chance of behaving itself." The crock sat in Temperance's spring house, half sunk into the cool, damp earth floor, a squat gray stoneware vessel with a wooden lid weighted down by a flat stone, and when Temperance lifted the lid, Sabra found herself looking at something she did not at first have words for. A thick, grayish, slightly translucent mass floating on the surface of the liquid inside, gelatinous and faintly ropey at its edges, not unlike a great pale mushroom cap resting on the vinegar beneath it, wobbling faintly when the crock shifted. "That," Temperance said, "is the mother. Mine's near 30 years old now, though it isn't truly the same piece the whole while. She grows and she splits, and you take what you need off the top and she keeps making more. Same as a starter for bread never really stays the same lump of dough forever, though folk call it one continuous thing out of habit." She explained it the way her own mother had explained it to her, in the plain, unscientific language of 3 generations of farm women who had never once needed to know precisely why the thing worked, only that it did, and how to keep from ruining it. A barrel of cider left to sit turned hard first, the sweetness going over to spirit the way any cider left too long would go. And if you gave that hard cider air and warmth and a piece of the mother to start it working, the spirit turned again, slower and quieter than the first change, into vinegar. Sharp, clean, and done right, better than anything that came off a canal boat from Geneva. "The air is the whole trick most people get wrong," Temperance told her, turning the wooden lid over in her hands, so Sabra could see the loose weave of a piece of muslin tacked across its underside where the bunghole would sit. "Shut a barrel up tight the way you would to keep cider sweet and you smother her. She wants to breathe same as anything living wants to breathe, and a barrel with no air in it just sits there sour and stubborn and never becomes anything at all, or worse, it goes wrong in some other direction entirely, and you don't find out until you've wasted half a year waiting on it. Cloth over the bunghole, never a bung hammered home, and some place with real warmth to it. A loft that catches the summer sun is better than any cellar, whatever your instinct tells you about keeping things cool and careful the way you would milk or meat. Cold is her enemy near as much as being shut up tight is, maybe more, because cold alone she might fight through slow. But cold and smothered both together, and she never gets a proper start." She ladled a portion of the mother, along with several quarts of her own working vinegar to prime it, into a clean stone jar for Sabra to carry home, refusing outright when Sabra tried to press a coin on her for it. "You'll pay me back if it takes," she said, "by not ruining 40 barrels through carelessness and giving vinegar makers a bad name in this hollow. That's payment enough for an old woman, and it's a debt you can settle a jug at a time once you've got something worth pouring." Temperance also warned her, almost as an afterthought on her way out the door that first afternoon, about a milder trouble than the ropey failure that would come later. A thin white film, sometimes called flowers of wine by the old country women, harmless in small amounts but liable, left unchecked, to weaken a barrel's strength over time if it spread across the surface unchecked. "Skim it gently with a clean spoon the moment it appeared," she said. "Same as skimming cream off standing milk, and don't let a fear of disturbing the mother stop a necessary skimming, because the mother could take a good deal more handling than most beginners assumed once she'd truly taken hold." Before Sabra left, Temperance walked her once more through the whole sequence, the way a careful teacher repeats a lesson she suspects will be needed under pressure long after the lesson itself is forgotten in its particulars. Rack the cider clean off its sediment first, because sediment left to rot in a working barrel would ruin it from underneath before the mother ever had a fair chance. Prime each barrel with mother and working vinegar both, not one without the other, because the mother alone worked slower than it needed to, and vinegar alone without a fresh mother sometimes simply stayed vinegar without ever growing enough of itself to seed a second generation. Cover, never seal. Place warm, never merely convenient. Write it down if you're the writing sort, Temperance added, watching Sabra's basket for the jar. "I never did, and I've paid for that laziness more than once over 30 years. Forgetting which barrel I'd already tended on a given evening, and tending it twice while its neighbor went untouched a full week." Over the 4 days that followed, with Temperance coming up twice to oversee the work and Ezra Poole hired back for 2 of them at 40 cents a day, Sabra racked every one of the 40 barrels, drawing the cider off its heavy sediment through a length of clean rubber hose into barrels she had scrubbed and scalded herself with boiling water and a stiff brush, leaving the thick lees behind in the old containers to be dumped on the compost heap, because lees left to rot in the working vinegar would sour the whole batch with an off, muddy taste. No amount of patience could fix later, a lesson Temperance had learned the hard way herself 30 years before and passed along now as flatly as any other fact of the trade. It was slow, unglamorous work, hauling water and scalding staves and hunching over a hissing siphon hose that twice slipped its hold and sent cider splashing across her boots. And by the second day, Her hands had gone raw at the knuckles from the lye soap she used to scrub each barrel's interior, a small cost she noted in the margin of the ledger, the same as any other. She caught herself, on the second afternoon, reaching to prime barrel 17 a second time, having lost her place in the row while stopping to help Ezra right an overturned bucket, and only her own chalk numbers on the staves saved her from wasting a second dose of the mother where a first had already gone in. She stood a moment afterward, simply grateful she had bothered with the numbering at all, and resolved aloud, to nobody in particular, that she would check the chalk before her hands, twice from then on, rather than trusting memory alone. Into each freshly racked barrel, Sabra ladled a portion of Temperance's mother, and a measure of her own already working vinegar to prime it, tacked a double layer of muslin over the open bung hole, and tied it fast with cord rather than driving a bung home, and set the barrel upright in a long, careful row along the loft's warmest wall, the one that caught the afternoon sun through a gable window Caleb had cut for hay pitching 2 summers before and never lived to see put to any better use. She numbered each barrel in chalk, 1 through 40, and recorded the date it was racked in the same worn ledger Caleb had once used for the farm accounts, a habit she had picked up from him without ever quite deciding to. The plain columns feeling less like bookkeeping and more like a kind of company in an empty house. By the evening of the 4th day, 40 barrels stood in rows under her own roof, cloth-covered and unhurried, doing nothing at all that anyone standing in the loft could see, which was, Temperance assured her, wiping her hands on her apron and surveying the finished rows with the satisfaction of a job done properly, exactly as it should be. Word of what the widow Ransom was doing with her 40 ruined barrels reached the general store well before the barrels themselves had finished settling into their new rows, and Amity Landing, having already enjoyed one good laugh at the dock, discovered it had appetite for a second helping. Sabra went down to Gill's on the following Saturday for a length of clean muslin. She needed more than Temperance had been able to spare, enough to cover 40 bungholes properly, 35 cents worth by Gill's own reckoning at the counter, and found 2 women from down the lake road already at the counter ahead of her, discussing in the particular carrying half-whisper women use when they want to be overheard without technically being caught at it. The widow up on the ridge, who had paid good money to haul home a barn full of rotten cider and was now, by all accounts, trying to brew it into something. Vinegar, one of them said, drawing the word out as though it were faintly ridiculous on its own merits. From cider that was already spoiled to begin with. I don't see how spoiling a thing twice improves it any. The vinegar widow, the other one said, and laughed, pleased with herself for having found a name for it, and the name traveled exactly the way names like that always traveled in a town the size of Amity Landing, attached to Sabra within the week, whether she answered to it or not, repeated at the church social and the mill and the smithy until it stopped sounding like an insult to anyone but her. A third woman, waiting her own turn at the counter, and not previously part of the conversation, asked mildly whether anyone had actually tasted the stuff before deciding it was foolishness, a question that drew no answer at all, which struck Sabra, overhearing it from the doorway, as the most honest moment in the whole exchange. She heard the name spoken behind her more than once that spring, sometimes with open amusement, sometimes with the softer, more uncomfortable pity people reserved for a widow they suspected of losing her good sense along with her husband. And she let it pass over her both times, the way she had learned, in 3 months of widowhood, to let a great many things pass over her that she could not afford to spend energy fighting. Gill himself, wrapping her muslin at the counter, was more direct about his doubts than the gossiping women had been, though no less certain of them. I'll tell you plainly, Mrs. Ransom, because I think you'd rather hear it plain than have me smile at you and mean nothing by it, he said, folding the cloth with the same care he gave every purchase, large or small. This county has bought its vinegar shipped in from the Ostrander works over at Geneva every year I've kept this store, and every year before that as far as I know. Folks trust a name on a barrel they've bought before, Mrs. Ransom, Same as they trust a preacher they've heard before over a stranger, whatever the stranger's sermon might say. I don't say your vinegar won't be good. I say I don't know a single housewife in this valley who'll pay for an unfamiliar jug with a widow's name on it when there's a trusted one sitting right beside it on the shelf. And I can't stock what I can't sell. A shelf's only worth what moves off it. I'm not asking you to stock anything yet, Mr. Gill, Sabra told him, folding the muslin into her basket. I'm asking for 35 cents of cloth. Come August, we can talk again about what you're willing to sell, and by then we'll both know a good deal more than we do standing here today. She said it evenly, without heat, because she had already done the arithmetic that made his doubt beside the point rather than an insult, and she had done it standing in her own loft 2 nights before, running a hand along 40 barrels. She could not yet call anything but a wager. Every jug of vinegar sold in Amity Landing came, as Gill had just confirmed for her free of charge, from one single source 100 miles up the lake, carried down by boat on a schedule that depended on water levels and weather and a dozen things no farmer in the valley controlled, and arriving every year without fail at exactly the season when every housewife in the county needed it most. Pickling season, when cucumbers and beans and green tomatoes came off the vines faster than any family could eat them fresh, and a jug of vinegar stood between a full pantry come January and an empty one come February. A trusted name shipped in from far away was a fine thing right up until the year it failed to arrive, and Sabra had grown up watching her own mother turn exactly that fragility into a small, steady income nobody else in that other county had ever bothered to compete for, because nobody else had 40 free barrels of already fermented cider sitting idle and a debt sharp enough to make the wait worth risking. Elam Firth himself came into Gill's store 2 days later on some errand of his own, and caught the tail end of the same gossip repeated back to him at the counter, and laughed along with it easily enough, the way a man laughs at a joke he considers himself the unwitting author of. I ought to charge the widow rent on those barrels, seeing as she's made a project of them, he said, loud enough to carry to the back of the store, and 2 farmers waiting on flour laughed with him, and Gill, to his credit, only allowed himself a thin, non-committal smile rather than joining outright. The remark traveled nearly as far as the Vinegar Widow name itself before the week was out, repeated at the mill and the smithy with small variations, each teller adding a little more relish than the last. Sabra heard a version of it herself 3 days later from a neighbor woman who plainly expected it to sting, and found, a little to her own surprise, that it didn't much, because a joke about rent on ruined barrels was, when she turned it over, simply one more piece of evidence that Elam Firth had not yet begun to imagine what those barrels might become. And a man who could not imagine the ending of a story was not a man whose opinion of its middle needed troubling her. Prentice Gill's own wife, for her part, had a different reaction to the whole affair than her husband's careful neutrality suggested he expected of her, remarking one evening over supper that a woman with the nerve to raise her hand at Firth's dock for $3 worth of ruin probably had more sense about her than the whole rest of the county laughing at her put together, a comment Gill relayed to no one, filing it away instead as one more small data point in an opinion he was not yet ready to declare settled. Sabra did not say any of her own arithmetic aloud to Gill across his counter, or to anyone else who repeated Firth's joke back to her in the weeks that followed. She simply thanked Gill for the muslin, tucked her basket under her arm, and walked home, past 2 more people who called her, not unkindly but not kindly either, the Vinegar Widow, and let the name sit on her shoulders like a coat she had not chosen but could, for the moment, still afford to wear. May came in warm that year, and by the middle of the month, the hay loft over Sabra's barn had become, without her having planned it quite this way, the single warmest room on the whole property through the long afternoons. The gable window Caleb had cut letting in a slant of direct sun that turned the loft into something close to an oven by 4 o'clock most days. Precisely the condition, Temperance had assured her more than once, that the mother needed most, and that every instinct a careful housewife owned told her to avoid. Sabra checked the barrels every morning before the rest of her chores and again most evenings, climbing the ladder with a lantern in the last light, running her hand along the row of 40 cloth-covered tops, watching for the changes Temperance had taught her to look for, and finding, more often than not, that the day's inspection was the calmest quarter hour her whole schedule allowed her, a small, deliberate ritual in a season otherwise governed by things that would not wait. The hay to be turned, the kitchen garden to be weeded, the fence line to be walked and mended wherever the winter's frost heave had worked a rail loose. By the third week, the change was visible without needing to be looked for at all. Where the barrels had first smelled only of raw, overripe hard cider, sharp and faintly rotten in the way that had made her eyes water that first evening, a different smell had begun working its way up through the muslin covers, cleaner and more biting, the kind of smell that caught in the back of the throat and made her cough the first few times she leaned too close over an open bunghole. Lifting the cloth from a barrel near the wall's warmest end, she found the surface of the cider had grown a thin gray-white film, not yet the thick gelatinous mass Temperance kept in her stone crock, but plainly its infant version, spreading slow and steady across the liquid the way a skin forms on scalded milk left standing on a windowsill. She recorded it in Caleb's old ledger against each barrel's number, a habit she had come to find steadying rather than tedious, the plain columns of dates and observations turning 40 barrels of uncertainty into something that at least looked on the page like a process rather than a wager. And some evenings she found herself lingering over the ledger longer than the entries strictly required, simply for the quiet company of a task with a clear right way to do it. Temperance came up twice that month to look the rows over herself, walking the length of the loft with her hands clasped behind her back the way a general might review troops, laying a palm flat against stave after stave to feel for warmth, pronouncing most of the barrels sound and pointing out two, tucked into the loft's north corner nearest a gap, where the old board siding had shrunk away from its frame, that she thought Sabra ought to watch more closely. "That corner's colder than the rest by a fair margin," she said, laying a hand flat against the barrel staves as though she could feel the difference through inch-thick oak. "I'd move them if you've anywhere warmer to put them. She works slower in the cold, and slow isn't always the same as safe. I've lost a barrel or two myself over the years to nothing worse than a drafty corner I was too lazy to fix, and I'd as soon you not learn that particular lesson the same way I did." On her second visit that month, Temperance also showed her a simpler trick she'd never gotten round to mentioning the first time. Dipping a clean straw into a barrel and holding a thumb over the top end to draw up a little sample without disturbing the working mother on the surface at all, a trick her own mother-in-law had taught her decades before, and that saved, Temperance said, no end of unnecessary lid-lifting on the barrels that were still plainly too young to bother checking closely. Sabra meant to move them. She wrote it in the ledger as a task for the following Sunday, in the same careful hand she used for everything else. And then a lamb got loose from the neighboring Purdy place and tangled itself in her own fence line, and cost her the better part of a morning freeing it and mending the wire. Besides, and then 3 days of steady rain kept her from the loft roof repair she'd been putting off since March. Water finding its way through a gap in the shingles she'd meant to patch before the barrels ever arrived, and the 2 barrels in the cold corner stayed exactly where they were through May and into June, a small unfinished line in a ledger otherwise filling steadily with good news, the kind of postponement that never feels like a decision while it's happening, and only afterward reveals itself to have been one all along. It was in the first week of June that the news from Geneva reached Amity Landing, carried down the lake by a canal boat captain who stopped at Firth's warehouse to take on freight and mentioned it, almost as an aside, while his crew loaded barrels of the season's first cheese onto his deck. "The Ostrander works," The great vinegar cellars at Geneva that had supplied every general store on Seneca Lake for as long as anyone in the valley could remember had burned in a barrel house fire that April, the same week as it happened, that Sabra had first walked her 40 barrels up the hill from Firth's dock, though neither fact would mean anything to the other for months yet. The fire had taken the whole of the Ostrander standing stock, 3 years of aging vinegar, gone in a single night, along with the cooperage sheds and half the loading dock besides. And while the family meant to rebuild, everyone along the canal understood that rebuilding a vinegar works meant rebuilding not just barrels and buildings, but years of slow, patient souring that could not be hurried along by money alone, and there would be no shipment coming down the lake that autumn, nor likely the autumn after either. The fire itself, as later accounts filtering down the canal told it, had started in a cooperage shed attached to the main cellar, sparked by an overheated glue pot left too near a stack of seasoned staves, and had spread fast enough through the dry timber that the Ostrander family counted themselves fortunate to save the house standing beside it. Nobody in Amity Landing had any particular stake in the Ostranders' misfortune beyond the practical one of where their own vinegar was going to come from that year, and the story was retold, when it was retold at all, less as tragedy than as inconvenience, the way news from 100 miles off so often was. Gil heard it directly from the boat captain, and repeated it to every customer who came through his door for the better part of a week, mostly as a piece of unwelcome business news, a gap in his shelves he did not yet know how to fill, wondering aloud to more than one customer whether he oughtn't write to a works down in Elmira before the good stock got claimed by other stores along the lake, and grumbling once, within Sabra's own hearing, though not directly to her, that a man could plan around drought or blight or a slow winter, but a fire in another county entirely was the kind of thing that simply arrived and rearranged a whole season's ledger without so much as a warning letter. It did not occur to him, telling it, that he was describing the exact shape of the opportunity sitting quietly in a hayloft 1.5 miles up the Ridge Road, cloth-covered and patient, with 5 full months left to finish becoming what the whole county was about to discover it desperately needed. And Sabra, standing near enough to hear him say it, kept her own face as unremarkable as she had kept it at Firth's dock in April, though she counted the months on her fingers twice that same evening once she was home and certain nobody was watching her do it. Temperance had taught her over those first weeks the plain, unhurried way a farm woman judged a barrel of working vinegar ready without any instrument fancier than her own nose and tongue. Draw a little off with a clean dipper, hold it up to whatever light was available, and look for clarity. No cloudiness, no thick strings hanging off the dipper's lip when you tipped it back into the barrel. Smell it close and trust the sting that made your eyes water a little as a good sign rather than a bad one, the sharp, clean bite of real vinegar being nothing at all like the flat sourness of cider merely gone bad and left to sit. And last, taste the smallest amount on the tip of the tongue, feeling for a bright, clean, acid edge that cut through and vanished, rather than a dull, lingering sourness that sat heavy on the tongue and refused to leave. A barrel doing well by every one of those tests, Temperance said, was a barrel doing exactly what it was meant to do. And by the middle of June, walking the row with a dipper and a lantern on a warm evening with the swallows working the barn eaves outside, Sabra found barrel after barrel answering each test the way she had been taught to hope for. Clear, sharp, biting, honest, each one a small private confirmation that the whole improbable venture was still so far going right. She worked her way down the row methodically, barrel 11, barrel 12, barrel 13, each dipper drawn and tested and returned, the good news accumulating in small, unremarkable increments the way most good news on a working farm actually arrived, nothing like the single dramatic turn a story might make of it. The 2 barrels in the cold north corner answered none of them. She drew the dipper from the first of the pair, expecting, at worst, a slower version of the same good progress the rest of the row was showing, and found instead a liquid that clung to the dipper's edge in a slow, thick, faintly ropey string rather than running clean. cloudy where it should have been clear, smelling flat and faintly wrong rather than sharp, with none of the honest sting that made her eyes water over every other barrel in the loft. She told herself, standing there with the lantern throwing long shadows across the loft floor, that it might simply be behind the others, slower rather than spoiled, and drew a second dipper to be sure, and the second dipper told her the same thing the first had, no clearer and no sharper, the same reluctant, ropey string hanging off the wood. The second barrel, when she checked it, told the same story again. She stood there a long moment with the lantern in one hand and the dipper in the other, running through everything Temperance had told her about what a healthy barrel ought to be, and understood, with the particular sinking clarity of a mistake finally made visible, exactly where she had gone wrong. These were the two barrels Temperance had warned her about in May, the coldest corner of the loft, the ones she had meant to move and never had, and checking the bunghole covers to be certain, she found she had been right to suspect worse besides. These were also, she realized, two of the barrels she had, in her earliest and most anxious days of the work, tied down more tightly than the rest, worried more about dust and barn flies finding their way in than about air finding its way through, winding the cord twice round instead of once, and pressing the muslin snug, rather than leaving it loose the way Temperance had shown her, cold on one side and smothered on the other. And the mother in those two barrels had never properly taken hold at all. Something else, some duller and less useful process, had crept in instead and turned the cider ropey and flat rather than sharp. Exactly the double failure Temperance had warned could undo a barrel that might have survived either mistake alone. Temperance, sent for the following day, confirmed it within a minute of tasting, working the liquid once around her mouth and setting the cup down without ceremony. Cold and shut too tight, both at once, she said, not unkindly, but not softening it either, because softening it would have served nobody. Either one alone she might have fought through given time enough. I've nursed a cold barrel back before, and I've had one too tight come round once I loosened the cloth. Both together, and she never had a chance to start. It happens to every one of us who's kept a barrel long enough, Sabra, and I'll not have you sit up nights over 2 out of 40 when the other 38 are singing. There was nothing to be done for the two barrels beyond emptying them onto the compost heap and scrubbing the staves for reuse the following year, and Sabra did exactly that on a gray Tuesday afternoon in mid-June. Watching 60 gallons of what should have become good vinegar soak away into the ground behind the barn, the smell of it different even in failure, still not quite the smell of the ruin it had started as. She went inside afterward and wrote the loss into Caleb's old ledger in the same plain hand she used for every other entry, 2 barrels, north corner, cold and oversealed, a loss rather than skirting around it or leaving it out, because a ledger that only recorded what went right was not truly a ledger at all, only a wish written down and dressed up to look like arithmetic, and she had promised herself back in April that whatever else this venture became, it would not become that. The loss did not stay private for long. Ezra mentioned it in passing to a friend while picking up nails at Gill's store, meaning no particular harm by it, and by the following Sunday, the story making its way around Amity Landing had grown, the way stories in that town reliably grew, from 2 barrels lost to something closer to the whole loft gone to ruin, the Vinegar Widow's scheme collapsing exactly the way sensible people had predicted it would from the start. Sabra heard 3 separate versions of her own failure that week, each one worse than the last, one of them insisting the smell had gotten so bad she'd had to move out of her own house, another claiming Firth himself had gone up the hill to demand his barrels back, which he had done no such thing, and heard, underneath most of them, a note of something that was not quite malice, but was not far from satisfaction either. The particular relief people feel when a thing they had already decided to laugh at obligingly confirms itself worth laughing at. Ezra himself, mortified once he understood how far his idle remark had traveled, rode up the ridge road unasked to apologize, standing in her dooryard, turning his hat over in his hands, and insisting he hadn't meant for it to turn into what it had turned into. Sabra told him there was nothing to forgive, that a story loose in Amity Landing grew wild whether a 17-year-old boy watered it or not, and set him to hauling water for the compost heap instead of standing there apologizing, which seemed to settle his conscience considerably faster than words would have. Prentice Gill, hearing the worst of the versions repeated at his own counter, found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, correcting a customer's exaggeration with more force than the situation strictly required, telling the woman plainly that he'd heard it was 2 barrels and not 40, and that a woman ought to get her facts from the widow herself before repeating them as gospel. A small defense he did not examine too closely afterward, for what it might mean about which side of his own earlier doubt he was beginning to drift toward. Even his own wife, who had said nothing critical of the venture from the start, found herself defending it a little more pointedly than she had planned to at a quilting circle that same week, pointing out to the room, not unreasonably, that 2 barrels lost out of 40 was a smaller failure rate than most of the husbands present had managed with their own hay crop that spring. A remark that landed with enough force to end the topic for the rest of the afternoon. Sabra let the gossip pass over her too, the way she had learned to let the rest of it pass, and went back up to the loft each evening to check the remaining 38 barrels, which were, whatever the county currently believed about them, coming along exactly as they should, indifferent to gossip in the specific way that 38 barrels of slowly souring cider had the luxury of being. By the first week of August, the earliest barrels racked back in April had been working for the better part of 4 months, and Sabra climbed the loft ladder one warm evening with a length of clean flannel and a row of scrubbed glass jugs, uncertain whether she was about to confirm the county's low opinion of her or her own long-held private one. She drew the dipper from the first barrel in the row and held it to the last of the evening light coming through the gable window, and what came up was nothing like the pale, cloudy, raw cider that had gone into that barrel back in April. A liquid the color of dark honey, entirely clear, without a trace of the sediment or film floating loose in it, sharp enough on the nose to make her blink and clean enough on the tongue to make her understand, all at once, and with a certainty that had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion, that her mother's 20-year-old trick had worked a second time in a hayloft above Seneca Lake, on a scale her own mother had never once attempted in a spring house 2 counties away. She strained it that evening the way Temperance had shown her, pouring each barrel slowly through a double layer of clean flannel stretched over a funnel to catch the last loose fragments of mother and the fine sediment that settled during the working months, careful not to disturb the barrel's own mother more than she had to, since a portion of it would go back into next year's fresh cider, the same way Temperance's crock had fed itself for 30 years running. The work went slower than she expected, the flannel clogging every few jugs with fine sediment that had to be rinsed clean before she could continue, and her shoulders ached by full dark from the steady lift and pour, lift and pour. But the vinegar ran through amber and clear into jug after jug, lined up along the loft floor, 31, 32, and by the time she'd worked through 11 barrels, she had 11 full-gallon jugs standing in a row that caught the lantern light like something poured rather than merely stored, glowing a deep warm gold that looked, to her tired eyes, less like farm produce and more like the coin it represented. She sent word to Temperance the following morning, and the old woman walked down the hollow within the hour, drew a taste from the nearest jug without ceremony, held it in her mouth a moment with her eyes half closed, and nodded once, the closest thing to unqualified praise Sabra had yet heard out of her. "Better than what I make," Temperance said, "and I'll not pretend that doesn't sting a little 30 years in. You've a heavier hand with the mother than I ever learned to have, and a warmer loft besides, and it's served you both." She kept back, from that first evening's straining, a single unlabeled jug she did not intend to sell at any price, setting it apart on its own shelf the way a person sets aside the first good thing a long effort produces, not because it was different from the rest in any way she could taste or measure, but because it had been the first, and some things earned a place on a shelf simply by arriving before the others did. Over the following 2 weeks, working an hour or two each evening after her other chores were done, Sabra strained her way through the remaining 27 sound barrels, recording each one in the ledger against the number she had chalked on its staves back in April. 38 barrels in total once the 2 ropey losses were set aside, near 30 gallons of finished vinegar drawn from each, which by her own careful arithmetic worked out in the ledger margin more than once before she trusted the number enough to write it plainly in the main column, came to something better than 1,100 gallons of clear amber cider vinegar, standing in jugs and remaining barrels in a hayloft that had, 4 months earlier, held nothing but 40 barrels of another man's failure and a smell strong enough to water her eyes at 20 paces. She stood among the finished rows one evening with the ledger open in her lap, the loft still faintly warm from the day's sun, and allowed herself briefly the small, unfamiliar luxury of simply looking at what she had made rather than immediately calculating what it still needed to become, a kind of stillness she had not permitted herself since before Caleb died, and one she found she had nearly forgotten how to sit inside of. 1,100 gallons of anything was, by any measure, more than one widow on 11 acres could reasonably use, sell to her own neighbors, or even store comfortably through a single season. And Sabra understood, standing among the jugs with her tally fresh in the ledger, that the vinegar itself, however good it had turned out, was still only half the arithmetic. The bank's $81 did not care how clear or how sharp her vinegar tasted. It cared only whether she could turn 1,100 gallons of it into coin before the last day of September, in a county that had, as far as anyone standing in Gill's store could yet tell her, still not entirely stopped laughing, and a jug of excellent vinegar sitting unsold in a hayloft was, in the end, no better to a bank than a barrel of ruined cider had been to Elam Firth. Production, she reminded herself, closing the ledger for the night, had only ever been the half of the problem she already knew how to solve. She loaded 4 jugs onto the wagon on a Saturday morning in the second week of August and drove them down to Gill's store herself, setting them on his counter without preamble and asking him plainly to taste before he said anything at all. Gill had not forgotten his own doubts from April, and he did not pretend to have forgotten them now, but he was, whatever else could be said of him, a fair man where his own counter was concerned, and he uncorked the nearest jug, poured a careful half-inch into a tin cup, and tested it the way any storekeeper who had spent 11 years judging shipped goods would test an unfamiliar one, smelling it first, holding it to the window light to check its clarity, and finally tasting a small amount, working it over his tongue with the deliberate care of a man who did not intend to be embarrassed twice in one spring. "Well," he said, after a silence that stretched long enough to make Sabra's pulse climb a little despite her best effort to hold her face as still as his. "Well, Mrs. Ransom, I'll say this plainly since I said the other thing plainly back in April, and it's only fair to balance the account. This is honest vinegar. Better than honest if I'm being truthful about it, clearer than the last lot Ostrander ever sent me, and sharper besides, and I've tasted enough shipped vinegar in 11 years to know the difference." He was quiet a moment longer, turning the cup in his hand, running the numbers a storekeeper runs before he commits shelf space to anything. "I can't promise you I'll sell it fast," he said finally. "Folks are set in their habits, and a new name takes time to earn trust, fire at Geneva or no fire at Geneva. But I'll take 12 gallons off you today at 18 cents, and we'll see what the shelf tells us inside a fortnight. That's a fairer trial than most new goods get out of me, and you should know it." 12 gallons at 18 cents came to $2.16, and Sabra counted the coins Gill laid on the counter into her own tin box with the same unhurried care she had used for Firth's $3 back in April, aware even as she did it that $2.16 against an $81 debt was not by itself a number worth much celebration. But it was the first coin the county had paid her for the thing itself rather than for hauling it away, and there was a woman standing near the store's front window that same morning. a Mrs. Purdy from the neighboring farm, who had come in for salt and stayed to watch the whole exchange with open curiosity, who asked, before Sabra had even finished loading her empty jugs back onto the wagon, whether she might buy a jug direct rather than wait for it to reach Gill's shelf, and paid 22 cents a gallon for 2 full gallons on the spot, cash in hand. No persuading required at all, remarking only that her own pickling cucumbers had come in early, and she'd sooner buy close to home than send her husband 3 towns over chasing rumor of a shipment that might never come. Gill set the 12 gallons out on his lowest shelf that same afternoon, a hand-lettered card beside them reading simply, "Local Vinegar," and watched, over the following days, with the particular professional attention of a man auditing his own doubts, as first one and then another customer picked up a jug more out of curiosity than conviction, tasted a spoonful at the counter when he offered it, and bought. One of those early customers, a Mrs. Otway who ran a boarding-house kitchen down near the packet dock and pickled cabbage by the barrel every September for a table of a dozen boarders, came back inside a week specifically to tell Gill, loud enough for 2 other customers to hear, that the widow's vinegar had cut clean through a batch of pickling brine better than anything she'd bought off a boat in 15 years, and would he be getting more, because she intended to buy the rest of whatever he had before somebody else did. Not every early customer was so generous. One man, a peddler passing through with a wagon of tinware, tasted a sample at the counter and pronounced it passable, but no better than what he could buy wholesale 2 counties over, a judgment Gill relayed to Sabra with a shrug, since a peddler's opinion, he said, was worth exactly what a peddler paid for anything, which was to say as little as the seller could be talked into accepting. It was not on the day of that first sale itself a large sum of money by any measure that mattered against the bank's deadline. But Sabra drove home that afternoon, turning over something Gill had said almost as an aside while she loaded the wagon, that his own son had mentioned the previous evening at supper, hearing 2 other women in the church aisle asking each other whether the Vinegar widow's vinegar might really be as good as the fire at Geneva was about to force every one of them to hope it was, and she understood, driving up the Ridge Road with an empty wagon and $2.16 in her tin box, that the shape of the thing had finally begun to shift, slowly, and without any single dramatic moment to mark it, the way real changes in a small town generally did, one cautious storekeeper and one practical neighbor at a time. Gill's 12 gallons sold out inside 9 days, faster than he had predicted even in his more optimistic moments, and he sent word up the Ridge Road by the middle of August, asking for 70 gallons more at the same 18 cents, a request that told Sabra, better than any gossip could have, exactly how thin every general store's vinegar shelf around the lake had grown since the news of the Geneva fire had finished making its rounds. September arrived hot and dry, and with it arrived the season every farm wife in the county had been quietly dreading through the whole of that long summer. Cucumbers coming off the vines faster than any household could eat them fresh, green tomatoes and beans and the last of the summer's cabbage all demanding to be put down in brine before the first hard frost took the growing season away entirely, and not one general store between Amity Landing and the county line with more than a few sour, half-empty jugs of old stock left on its shelves to meet the demand. By the second week of September, wagons had begun arriving at Sabra's own gate directly, a thing that would have seemed, back in April, no more likely than the moon arriving there. Housewives she had exchanged nothing more than a nod with. At church came up the Ridge Road with their own jugs and crocks, some of them women who had laughed loudest at the dock in April, or repeated the worst version of the ropey barrel story in June, standing now in her own dooryard with coin in hand, and a patience they would not have extended to her 4 months before. She sold by the gallon and by the half-gallon, weighed her jugs on the kitchen scale Caleb had once used for seed corn, and kept a running tally in the ledger each evening, watching the column of small sums accumulate with the same steady attention she had once given the column of ropey barrel losses. One woman, a Mrs. Aldous, from 3 farms down, stood in the yard working up the nerve to say something and finally admitted, not quite meeting Sabra's eye, that she'd been the one who'd called it foreign cheese nobody wanted back in April, mixing up one gossip story with another the way the whole county tended to by then, and had come to apologize as much as to buy. Sabra told her the vinegar was 2 gallons for the same coin regardless of what anybody had said in April, and let the matter rest there because there was pickling to be done in that woman's kitchen same as any other, and a grudge held on to too long cost more than it ever collected. A larger wagon came up from the Thistlewood place on the far side of the ridge the following week, sent by a widow farmer there named Nancy Thistlewood, who ran a dairy operation nearly twice the size of Sabra's own orchard, and needed vinegar by the barrel, rather than the jug for scalding her cheese equipment as much as for her own kitchen's pickling, and the 2 women struck a bargain on the spot for 18 gallons at the standing rate, Mrs. Thistlewood remarking dryly that she'd wasted a full month waiting on Gil's shelf to restock before finally thinking to ask where Gil himself had been getting his. A third gate trade customer that same week, a Mr. Kepler, who ran a small tannery below the landing and needed vinegar for reasons that had nothing to do with pickling at all, bought 4 gallons without any negotiation whatsoever and asked only whether she could supply him regularly through the winter, a question Sabra answered honestly, that she did not yet know but would by November, and wrote his name in the ledger's back pages against the following season regardless. It was, Sabra thought, driving nothing but noticing everything, a fair sign of how thoroughly word had finally outrun the old gossip. Buyers had stopped asking whether the widow's vinegar was good and started simply asking where to find enough of it. She watched, over those first gate trade weeks, the particular rhythm pickling season imposed on every kitchen in the county, the same rhythm her own mother's kitchen had once kept 2 counties east. Cucumbers brought in by the bushel and packed into crocks with dill and mustard seed, green tomatoes sliced and layered with onion for chow-chow, the whole house filled for a week straight with the sharp, briny smell of a winter's provisions being laid down against a season that would otherwise offer nothing fresh at all. Every one of those crocks needed vinegar strong enough to hold its work through a long, cold, cellar-bound winter, and every housewife who came up her ridge road understood exactly what a weak or watered batch would cost her in February, when a jar gone soft or moldy meant a whole week's labor lost along with whatever the garden had given it. Sabra sold nothing she would not have trusted in her own cellar, and said so plainly to more than one buyer who asked, which cost her nothing, and earned her, she suspected, more of the trade's steady return custom than any amount of Firth's old dockside charm ever could have. It was not, even with the gate trade running steady and Gil's second order paid and delivered, quite enough. She sat at the kitchen table on the evening of the 18th of September, 3 days shy of 2 weeks before the note came due, and added the whole column from April to that date. Firth's $3, Gil's 2 orders, Mrs. Purdy, and every other gate sale since, and came to a total of $61.10, a sum that fell short of the $81 owed at the bank by a margin of $19.90, with less than 2 weeks left and roughly 800 gallons of vinegar still standing in jugs and barrels in the loft, waiting on buyers who had not yet come in enough numbers. $19.90 was not the impossible gap $81 had once been, sitting in this same kitchen back in February. It was, all the same, a real gap, and Sabra sat with the ledger open in front of her a long while that evening, doing the arithmetic of how many more gate wagons and how many more 18-cent orders from Gil it would take to close it in the days remaining, and arrived at no answer that felt entirely certain, only the same stubborn conviction that had gotten her this far and would have to carry her the rest of the way as well. She did not yet know, closing the ledger and banking the fire for the night, that the largest single order she would fill that whole autumn was, at that very hour, 3 miles down the Ridge Road at Amity Landing, taking shape in the mind of a man who had once told her, laughing, that he would throw in $3 just for the pleasure of never smelling her 40 ruined barrels again. Elam Firth's difficulty, which he had spent the better part of 2 weeks trying to solve through every channel a produce merchant of 11 years' standing normally had available to him, was not vinegar exactly. It was reputation. Firth's produce and commission house stood as the forwarding point for 6 smaller general stores scattered around the lake's eastern shore, storekeepers who trusted him to fill their standing orders reliably twice a year in exchange for a commission on everything that passed through his warehouse, and every one of those 6 men had written to him since the Geneva fire's news reached them, asking, with increasing impatience as pickling season closed in, where their autumn vinegar order stood. Firth had written to 2 other vinegar works further down the canal, in Elmira and in Watkins, and both had answered that their own stock was already committed 3 deep to buyers closer to home, the same shortage that had emptied Gill's shelves having emptied shelves in every direction a canal boat could reasonably reach that season. He had even sent a man as far as Penn Yan on the chance of finding surplus stock nobody else had thought to claim, and the man had come back empty-handed and out 2 days' wages besides. One of his 6 storekeepers, a testy man from the lake's northern reach named Corcoran, had written him a second letter in as many weeks demanding to know whether he ought to simply drive to Geneva himself and see what the Ostranders had left standing. A letter Firth had no honest answer for, since he already knew, from the boat captain's own account, that the Ostranders had nothing left standing at all. By the 3rd week of September, Firth found himself, for the first time in 11 years of running that warehouse, entirely unable to fill a standing order his own name had promised, and a merchant whose word stopped being reliable in a lake town the size of Amity Landing did not stay a merchant for very long, a fact he understood better than most men in the county, having watched it happen to lesser competitors himself. He heard, the same way everyone eventually heard everything in that town, that the widow Ransom up on the ridge had vinegar, real vinegar, by every account reaching him, better than what Ostrander had ever shipped, and enough of it, if the gate trade everyone described was to be believed, to matter. He came up the ridge road himself on the 24th of September, driving his own light wagon rather than sending a hand, and found Sabra in the dooryard weighing out a half-gallon for a farm wife from down the lake, 3 more wagons waiting their turn behind her. A scene that would have been to the man standing at his dock back in April, nearly unrecognizable as belonging to the same 40 ruined barrels he had been so glad to be rid of. The farm wives waiting their turn recognized him at once, and a small current of amusement passed visibly among them, one leaning to murmur something to her neighbor behind a raised hand, because there was not a woman standing in that dooryard who hadn't heard, in one form or another, the story of the $3 and the barrels nobody wanted. And there was a particular satisfaction in watching the man who'd told that joke loudest, now waiting his turn same as the rest of them. He waited his own turn rather than pushing to the front of it, which Sabra noted and gave him no particular credit for, since a man waiting behind 3 farm wives at a widow's gate was still, in the end, a man who needed something he could not get anywhere else, and waiting politely for it did not change what had brought him up the hill. When his turn came, he looked past her shoulder at the row of barrels visible through the open barn door, and something in his face changed. A small involuntary shift, the look of a man recognizing his own hand in a place he had not expected to find it. The nearest barrels still carried, faint but legible where the staves had weathered gray over the summer, the burned mark of his own warehouse brand, an F inside a circle he had been stamping into cider barrels for 11 years without ever once imagining he would see it again standing on this particular hillside, full of something worth having last seen those same staves stacked and reeking in the coldest corner of his own warehouse not 6 months before. "I need vinegar, Mrs. Ransom," he said without preamble, which she appreciated more than she let show. 220 gallons, if you have it, for 6 stores that are asking me questions I can't presently answer and asking them less patiently by the week. He paused, and something of the old dockside ease crept back into his voice, an old habit reaching for its old footing before he'd fully decided whether the footing would hold. Given the barrels started as mine, I'd hoped we might discuss a rate that reflected that a little. A neighbor's rate, you might say. Sabra set down her scale and looked at him, and answered him with exactly the same flat, unhurried plainness she had used raising her hand at his dock 5 months before. 22 cents a gallon, Mr. Firth. Same as I've charged every wagon that's come up this road since August, and the same I'll charge the next one behind you. I don't sell it cheaper for a familiar face, and I don't sell it dearer for one either. That's the whole of my rate, and it hasn't moved for anybody yet. She did not say anything further about the $3, or the laughter on the dock, or the 60 gallons she had lost to 2 barrels sitting in a cold corner in June, because none of it needed saying aloud for either of them to understand exactly what was being settled in that dooryard, and because a ledger, done properly, did not need decoration to make its point. Firth held her gaze a moment, and whatever calculation ran behind his eyes settled, visibly, on the only answer available to a man with 6 impatient storekeepers and no other source in reach. The 3 farm wives who had watched the whole exchange from a discreet distance did not pretend afterward that they hadn't been listening, and one of them, walking her own filled jug back to her wagon, remarked to Sabra just loud enough for Firth's retreating back to catch it that some men took considerably longer to learn arithmetic than others, a small unkindness Sabra neither encouraged nor corrected, since she had long since decided that Amity Landing's ledger of who had laughed and who hadn't was not one she needed to keep herself. Firth paid it. 220 gallons at 22 cents came to $48.40, counted out into her palm in the same unhurried motion she had used, counting his $3 into her own apron 5 months before, and she watched him load the jugs into his wagon himself rather than waiting for a hand to do it, a small thing that told her, better than anything he might have said, exactly how badly he had needed to leave that dooryard with a full wagon rather than an empty promise. He did not make the joke about renting her the barrels a second time, and at the very last, hand already on the wagon seat, he allowed himself one plain sentence that cost him more than the $48.40 had. I'll say this for you, Mrs. Ransom. I misjudged the barrels. I don't believe I misjudged you exactly, so much as I never troubled to judge you at all, which I expect is its own kind of error. Sabra told him only that most errors of that particular kind corrected themselves eventually, given enough time and a fair enough set of scales, and went back to weighing out the next farm wife's half-gallon before he had finished turning his team. She drove down to Amity Landing herself 2 days later, on the 26th of September, with the ledger balanced and a sum in her tin box that had, between the gate trade's final week and Firth's $48.40, cleared the $81 owed with $41.70 still standing to her name besides. Dwight Sallow counted the coin twice across his own counter, the same careful, unhurried habit she recognized in her own hands, wrote the sum against her account, and brought the bank's stamp down on the note itself, paid inked across it in plain black letters, 4 days ahead of the deadline that had shadowed every week of her ledger since the previous February. He said, folding the paper back toward her, that he did not believe he had ever stamped a note paid early on a debt that same office had once told her in February she had little chance of clearing at all, and Sabra told him only that the arithmetic had simply taken longer than either of them expected to finish proving itself, and thanked him for reading the figures right side up for her that cold afternoon, rather than making her read them upside down the way some men in his position might have. By the middle of October, with the note paid and the first frost still a fortnight off, what had begun as 40 ruined barrels dumped into a hayloft had settled into something Sabra had begun, cautiously and only to herself at first, to call her Vinegar Works rather than merely her scheme. Gill had placed a standing order for the following year before the last of the current season's stock had even sold, and 2 of the 6 storekeepers Firth supplied had written to her directly asking whether she intended to expand the operation, a question she answered that autumn only by walking the loft each evening with the same careful attention she had given it in April, chalking numbers on staves and entering dates in Caleb's ledger, because a business built on patience did not get built any faster for being asked about whatever the asking implied about her prospects. She had already struck a standing arrangement with Firth himself before October was out, an arrangement neither of them discussed in terms of the $3 or the 40 barrels, though both understood exactly what it rested on. Any cider that turned past its selling window in his warehouse going forward would come to her first, at a fair price agreed in advance rather than as a favor paid in coin for hauling away. And Firth, whatever his dockside instincts had once told him about a widow with an odd notion, had become by the practical arithmetic of a merchant who valued a reliable supplier above his own old pride, something close to an ally rather than an obstacle. The 2 of them settling their business now in a handful of plain sentences across his own counter rather than in jokes traded for an audience. She had already begun, in the back pages of Caleb's ledger, sketching what a second loft might cost her to build come next summer if the arrangement with Firth held, and the Thistlewood order proved the first of more like it, penciled figures for lumber and a second gable window. Nothing committed yet, only the kind of quiet forward planning she had not allowed herself to indulge in since before the fever took Caleb. She had written, too, a short and businesslike letter to her mother's old county 2 days' ride east. The first she had sent since the funeral, informing her that the Croc's trick had traveled farther and larger than either of them had likely imagined it could, and received back, within the fortnight, a reply shorter than her own letter had been, saying only that she had always known the recipe was sound, and had wondered some years whether anyone left in the family still remembered it well enough to prove as much. She had also, with the surplus from Firth's purchase and the season's remaining stock, bought 6 sound-used barrels off a cooper in town, and set Ezra, now steady help 2 days a week rather than a boy hired by the job, to scrubbing and readying them for next year's lot, whatever that lot turned out to be, whether from Firth's overflow or from apples of her own, if the orchard's 3 young trees finally came into bearing. Ezra had taken to the work with an interest that surprised her, asking real questions now rather than merely tolerating her instructions, and confided one afternoon, hauling a barrel into place, that his father had come round some on the whole enterprise too, having tasted a jug Ezra brought home and pronounced it, with the same flat authority he'd once used to declare turned cider beyond saving, better than anything he'd bought at Gill's in a decade. Temperance had become a regular visitor who no longer needed asking before she climbed the loft ladder to check a row of barrels. She still, by her own quiet claim, understood better than anyone, though she said it now with less the tone of a teacher correcting a pupil and more the tone of one vinegar maker comparing notes with another who had, in a single season, matched work she had spent 30 years perfecting. The 2 of them had taken to sitting on the loft's top step some evenings after the checking was done, saying little, simply watching the light change over the ridge, which was its own kind of good company after a year that had offered Sabra very little company of any kind. On a clear gold afternoon in late October, with the orchard behind her turning the deep amber of late-season leaves and the loft doors thrown open to air out the last of the season's finished barrels, Sabra walked the yard, taking stock of what the year had actually built rather than what it had merely survived, new barrels stacked and ready for the following spring, a scale that no longer felt strange in her own hands, a ledger whose columns had finally begun running the direction she'd always meant them to. The name Vinegar Widow had not disappeared from the county's mouth, and Sabra had stopped expecting it to. What had changed was the tone underneath it, spoken now the way a town speaks the nickname of someone it has decided, whether it ever says so plainly or not, to respect, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had come to answer to it without flinching, the way a person comes to wear a coat long enough that it simply becomes the coat they own. The kitchen table that evening held what 4 months of patient, unglamorous labor had actually amounted to, laid out with the same plain honesty Caleb's ledger had always demanded of her. The account book itself, open to a column of figures running unbroken from $3 in April to a sum by October's end. That would have seemed, to the widow standing on Firth's dock that first cold morning, closer to a fable than an arithmetic. A row of corked amber jugs catching the last of the evening light through the kitchen window, more of them still standing in the loft than she had managed to sell that first season. And a small dish near the ledger's edge holding 3 silver coins she had never spent, the very ones Firth had first counted into her palm, kept back deliberately from every tin box reckoning since, not out of sentiment exactly, though there was some of that in it too, but as a kind of standing reminder, the plainest entry in any ledger she kept, that the difference between a worthless thing and a fortune very often came down to nothing more than whether anyone standing nearby was willing to look at it a second time, and whether they had somewhere warm enough and patient enough to let it prove itself. She had told Temperance the week before, turning the old woman's original stone jar over in her hands, where it now sat refilled and kept on the kitchen shelf, that she supposed the whole of what she had learned that year came down to a single plain fact her mother had never quite put into words for her, that most people looked at something spoiled and saw only what it had already failed to be, while the only real trick worth learning was patience enough to look at the very same thing and ask instead what it might yet still become, given air and warmth and enough time left alone to work. It was not a secret Amity Landing had lacked the wits to discover on its own. Every housewife in that county had known, in some plain, unspoken way, that hard cider left long enough in the right conditions would sour into something useful, the way farm knowledge always sits half-remembered in the backs of people's minds until circumstance forces it forward. It had simply lacked, for one dry season while a fire burned 100 miles up the lake, anyone willing to spend 40 barrels of another man's failure and 5 months of her own patience proving it out loud in front of the exact people who had laughed loudest at the notion that she might. She thought, closing the account book for the last time that evening, of Dwight Sallow's plain black stamp coming down on the note, and of Firth's F burned into staves he'd once been glad to see the last of, and understood that both marks amounted, in their own separate ways, to the same fact written twice, that a thing declared worthless by every voice in a county did not become worthless simply because the county said so, provided somebody with patience enough was willing to let the arithmetic run its full course. Caleb's old ledger sat closed now at the far end of the table, its later pages still blank, waiting on whatever the following spring asked of them, and Sabra found she no longer dreaded opening to a fresh column the way she had every month of that first hard winter. There would be another note someday, or another debt, or another season that tried to prove her wrong before it was finished proving anything at all. She was not fool enough to think one paid-off note bought her out of the ordinary weather of a widow's life on 11 acres of hillside. But she had 40 barrels worth of evidence now, entered in her own hand, that patience and a clear ledger could turn even a thing $3 had once been enough to buy her way out of into something worth having, and that was not nothing, on a hillside where nothing had so often seemed to be exactly what was on offer. She banked the fire, gathered the 3 coins back into their dish, and left the ledger open on the table overnight, the way she had once left a different, smaller stack of coins out to sea in the morning light, back when $41.70 would have seemed as unlikely as the note itself getting stamped paid a full 4 days early, and climbed the stairs to bed thinking not of Firth, or of Gill, or even of the bank, but of a squat stone crock in a spring house 2 counties east, and a girl of 9 or 10 watching from the doorway, who would have understood better than anyone else in Amity Landing exactly what 40 barrels of somebody else's ruin could become in the right hands, given enough patience to let it. If a story about patient, ledger-precise arithmetic winning out over a whole county's laughter is the kind of thing that keeps you watching until the very end, I'd be glad to have you subscribed for the next one, because there is always another worthless bargain waiting somewhere on this frontier, and always another widow or another fool. The neighbors were all too quick to name one, quietly proving the numbers out. Tap that like button on your way out if you haven't already. Tell me down in the comments where in the world you watched this one from, and I'll see you in the next story.